I see the numbers sort of slow down. It's pretty awesome. We're at about 572 right now. It's also pretty amazing that for this workshop, we have over 1,500 people signed up and registered to take on some professional learning. So thank you all for investing all your time and energy into this workshop, into this professional development, coming early this morning for an amazing keynote. You're going to be really excited for. See, it's still climbing. All right, well, we'll get going here, sort of flattening out a little bit as we go here. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. And I really just want to honor that you made it here this morning after, I think it's a gross understatement to say how difficult of a year it's been. Just been with the pandemic, all the social unrest. I mean, our communities in this country have been significantly impacted in a number of ways. And so coming here to engage in this conversation and in this professional development it's really touching, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I know this group is honored. I know every presenter out there that we have, many amazing speakers and moderators here to do some professional development with you are all very excited and honored to be a part of this. You know, this year there's been a lot of adverse childhood experiences, right? And I think you've heard me, if you've heard me at all, talk about any trauma work that we acknowledge that. The chronic stress for all of us has been really hard to handle. And our youth have been really impacted, especially our marginalized youth. There's been significant stress and trauma that has impacted their learning and their families. And I know also during this time, we go into that growth mindset. We know that this has been a time for us to reconnect maybe with families and understand the importance of connection and community and how important that is for all of us. And so that's what this workshop's all about. Yes, it's about connecting a lot of initiatives and a lot of work we've done, right? We're here to connect equity with trauma responsive practices, with restorative practices, and with social emotional learning. It's all connected. It's all work that helps us as staff and helps our students feel like they belong and that they're valued. And that's the real point of it. And I hope that this day, with this work that you're engaging in, that you get some skills and you gain some confidence to be able to do that. These are the most important protective factors we have. You know, there's some things out of our control. We don't get to make sure that everybody is financially stable or that we provide health care to everybody. But the protective factors of belonging and connection, we can do that. And we can be those positive adults for each other and for our youth. So I hope that you feel that in this professional development, that you gain some skills and some confidence. And thank you again for being here. All right, I'm going to hand this over. We're gonna introduce the Gemini Group. I'm gonna let Remy talk a little bit about why we brought this amazing duo here today with us.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Remy Rummel, the Director of Language, Culture, and Equity. I'm so happy to see we have 818 so far people joining this morning. So we have the honor of learning from the Gemini Group, Mr. Dante and Mrs. Christina James, and we really are so thrilled that they agreed to come to Douglas County. Last year, we attended our equity team. So Dr. Chris Page, Dr. Jan Lanning, Jennifer Gottschalk, Jack Kronser, and I joined the Gemini Group's training with the Colorado Department of Education. And they did an equity workshop over a couple of months with about 20 teams across the district or across the state, including our district. And so we learned an incredible amount from them. It was just really some very thoughtful and constructive learning for our team as we proceeded with the strategic plan work that we had been engaging in, looking at equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And so they really pushed our thinking, and they're just wonderful people. That's what we connected and decided that this would be a great step for the equity team in terms of learning, and then bringing them to Douglas County to introduce all of us and push our thinking and to learn and grow along with us. So Dr. Page, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Thank you, Remy. Dr. Chris Page, principal of the Highlands Ranch High School. Just to add on to that, one of the best things about the experience is that while we went through training, our training lasted all day. It was intense in some regards. It was eye-opening. It was validating for some of the feelings that we often get when we talk about things like diversity and equity, inclusion, access. And we felt very strongly that this same feeling is something that everyone in Douglas County is sort of hovering around. And so we just need as a collective to know how to move forward. I think one of the great things about the Gemini Group and hopefully what you'll be able to experience this morning is they are going to challenge some of your thinking, right? Maybe some of your preconceptions and things like that. On the same note, they're going to validate some of your emotions and some of your feelings about things going on in the world today. But most importantly, they want to engage you in the ability to have open thought, dialogue, conversation to continue to move our district forward. And so we are so excited to have them here. I appreciate everyone who joined on for having such open minds, open hearts, and being willing to hear. And just know it should provide for a great platform for you and those other people in your building to really start engaging in some thought-provoking questions, but more importantly, in some soulful questions that really mean the world to you, and how you want to not only be represented in this district, but how you want the district to look in the next couple of years for yourself, for your own kids, and for the kids you teach every day. So thank you once again for showing up today. We're excited to have you, and now we're at 900.
Woo-hoo.
900, that's awesome. All right, so I'm not going to do any more further introductions, just to say that these two they have decades of experience dealing with big groups. They want to answer some questions. So near the end of this keynote, we're going to turn on the chat function, and then the rest of us are going to kind of monitor that and see if we can get some themes of questions to ask them. They really want to do that. And also know that they're going to be back this afternoon. If you look at the later sessions in your sched, there's a 2-hour block where they're talking to our community, but everybody here is invited to that. And that's going to be another opportunity to really engage with them. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Christina and Dante. Take it away.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning to the hundreds and hundreds of you that we can't see, but we are certainly glad that you're here. My name is Dante and
Christina.
And we are the Gemini Group. And equity is the work that we do around the country with school districts, higher ed, nonprofits, state and local governments, just across the board, really trying to help organizations infuse the concepts of equity into their work on a daily basis to ensure the best outcomes for everyone, certainly with a focus on communities of color at this point. We're just really honored to be able to be here and kick off this day of your professional development, kick off the Making Connections workshop. We've done keynotes before, but never like this. So hopefully there's a little appreciation and grace as we do it this way, because we'd love to see all of your faces, because it's also nice to be able to read the room, which is kind of difficult at this point. So we truly appreciate your presence. As was said, we've had the good fortune to be working with Douglas County for over a year through Colorado Department of Education and their work, but Douglas County has really stepped in and really wanted to do this work deeper, better, and infuse it across the entire district, which is just a wonderful approach. And we've already begun to see the positive outcomes for the work that they're doing. And we specifically want to thank the folks who've been mentioned already: Remy Rummel, Dr. Chris Page, Dr. Janet Lanning, Zachary Hess, Laura Gorman, and Jennifer Gottschalk for getting us here today, this morning. And so we truly appreciate their time, their effort, their energy, and the work that they put in to really make this a reality. And so we're here to talk about belonging. And what does that mean? But in a bigger context, equity. And we're also going to talk about institutional systemic racism and institutional bias. And it's not even past 8 a.m. yet. So we're going to step in very early with these difficult conversations, which are probably one of the more conversations that are difficult to have. So our goal is, as Dr. Page said, to just really hopefully inspire, challenge, give you some different ways to think, perspectives that maybe you hadn't thought of, Always happy to have an aha moment or so. So let's just get into it. So starting out, let's just start you with a quote that we love, which is from Nelson Mandela, that education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And so how are we being responsible with how we are educating our kids? So why that title in the first place of belonging? All children belong. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's no question that all children do belong. But the real question is, do all children feel like they belong? And we would argue that they don't. And so how do we ensure that we're doing better to make all of our kids feel like they belong? So let's describe belonging by starting with the opposite of what it is. So if we provide some different phrases, the opposite of belonging is feeling alone, or feeling lonely, feeling friendless, of feeling like an outsider, of feeling like you have to suppress yourself to be accepted for who you are. And nobody wants to feel like this. And certainly we don't want our kids to feel like this in our classrooms. And it's that sense of feeling othered, whether they can describe it that way or not. And so othering isn't about liking or not liking somebody. It's just a way of not recognizing another person's individual identity. And consequently, those who are othered are seen as less worthy of dignity and respect. It's about valuing all and feeling and being heard and seen, not feeling like I'm invisible. And even further, belonging is that sense of fitting in or feeling like you're an important and valued member of a group. And we know, certainly for kids, belonging doesn't insist that but certainly for kids, it's about their sense of self-identity that is still growing, that they're still shaping, they're still trying to figure out who they are, what they believe, all of those things. And so that sense of belonging is just so important. And it doesn't insist that we're all the same by any means. It means that we recognize and engage around our differences. And then we have to include those perspectives that are different than the dominant culture, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But also very clearly that differences don't mean deficit. This is not some deficit model. That we have to value the differences. And that means seeing the strength and the importance in these differences of all of our kids. And so how are their varying needs taken into consideration, even if they think that they are feeling like they belong? But how are we, as the adults and the educators in this context, really taking into consideration the varying needs to ensure that we are creating equitable outcomes for all of them?
So before we get into the main topic of equity, we just want to go through some foundational definitions, just to make sure we're all sharing a common language from the get-go, right? We all know what diversity is. Diversity is just difference. Inclusion, what we like to consider inclusion, is that belonging plus, right? It's that feeling of belonging, but then there's that plus factor where our diversity is being heard, being seen, being valued, having a seat at the table, being a part of the decision-making process, having a true voice in the change. And then equity, right? Equity is that larger umbrella that we see diversity and inclusion and belonging falling under, right? Equity is about those equitable outcomes. Equity, you have equity when someone's identity cannot predict their outcomes, because we know for a fact that the darker your skin color in this country, the darker your skin color, the more harsh your outcomes in any facet of life. So when we have equity, we have that ability to say your identity does not predict your outcome. And, with that said, we're stressing outcomes. And in doing that, we want to make sure it's clear we're not talking about intentions, right? So many of us have the best intentions. We want to do good and we want to help. Our intentions are irrelevant in this conversation because equity is about outcomes and impacts. It's not about intentions.
And sometimes we get stuck on the idea of creating opportunity or creating access. That does not necessarily change the outcome if the system itself is biased in how it engages with those students or whomever is within that system.
Mm-hmm. And, let's also point out one more thing, that equality is good, but equality also will not get us to equity. We can treat everyone the same, but not have equitable outcomes, because we know in the classroom alone, not every student's needs are the same. Not every colleague's needs are the same. So if we treat everyone the same, we're not addressing people where they are. We're not giving them what they need based on their lived experience and their history and whatever else, right? So equity is about meeting people where they are and meeting their specific needs. That's what gets us to the equitable outcomes. And then also that getting to equity is a critical thinking process, right? It's asking the right questions. And this afternoon, we'll go into more detail about what are those questions that you should ask? How are you questioning assumptions? How are you challenging the status quo, right? How are you challenging the systems that have always upheld the dominant culture benefits, but not everyone else? And then dominant culture. We've referenced it a couple times. When we say dominant culture, we're not talking about the highest percentage of the population. Right? We're talking about the identity that represents those people who are typically in positions of power in this country. They're in the positions of power of institutions and systems that we all operate in. And that identity is very specific. It's white, it's male, able-bodied, Christian, and straight. Now, I'm not saying all positions of power are held by this identity, but if you look around, the majority of positions of power are held by this identity. And when I say positions of power, I don't just mean, the superintendent, the principals, the assistant principals. You as teachers hold power in your classrooms. And then race. Just to be clear, when we talk about race, we're talking about race and ethnicities of color. Okay, and understanding and remembering that race is a social construct. There's nothing biological about race. We created race. And if we created it, we can dismantle it and reach true equitable outcomes.
So why the conversation about equity? Why do we need to talk about it? Why is it important? It's not a new conversation. I mean, equity's been in use for a long time in various ways. We can talk about college scholarships that are based on need. We can talk about grants that are based on need. Not everybody gets the same $5,000 because they're based on need. That's equity. And then truly talking about race in this country is not something new. The word white was first used in legislation in 1681. So it's been around since before we were a country. Education was allowed to be legally segregated from 1896 to 1954. That's a very long time to overcome the vestiges of all of that. Again, 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate with all deliberate speed. I think we're still working on that. Indian boarding schools, if you know what those are, where kids living on reservations were literally kidnapped by the federal government and sent across the country most of the time to have their nativeness stripped of them, their language, their culture, their religion, their spirituality, so they could be better servants for the dominant culture. The last school closed that way was 1984 in the state of Utah. In 2010, one of the largest school districts in the state was found to have violated the civil rights of Latino students and Spanish-speaking students and teachers. In 2020, the president's executive order stated that anyone who receives federal funding, any organization receiving federal funding, cannot provide training around race or systemic racism. So talking about race is nothing new. Fixing things around race is what has become the conversation of the day as we watch the news over and over. This is not a new conversation. But it's also one of the most difficult to have for organizations and institutions. It's easier to default to the next any other conversation except talking about race. Because the more we talk about it, the more divisive we make it. All of those explanations and examples and rational efforts to divert from a conversation around race. But it's based on the concept of, at least as our approach is, on the concept of targeted universalism, which is a philosophy espoused by Dr. John Powell out of UC Berkeley, who heads the Othering and Belonging Institute. that by focusing on those who are most impacted in society, you will positively impact everyone else. But if you try to be all things to all people all at once, you end up being not much to anybody. And so how are we focusing on who are those kids specifically who are most impacted, those kids of color who are most impacted in the educational system, so that we can positively benefit everyone else? And there's a quote that just moves us in this work, which is that if children of color are old enough to experience racism, white kids are old enough to learn about it. So how are we doing better to ensure that everyone understands what this is we're talking about, so we can begin to eliminate it as we see it? Because this is all about the children, all about the kids you teach. How do we help them become better stewards in a global society, in a global world, in a multicultural world that they're going to walk through, that they're walking through right now? So how do we help them navigate that? And I absolutely want to say that equity is not a partisan issue. It's not some political issue. It's been used that way. It's been hijacked that way on some level. But that doesn't make it true. The fact that we're focusing on how we can best serve all of our kids has nothing to do with politics, or shouldn't. It should be all about how we best serve our children. And there's a quote that, as you can tell, we love quotes. A quote by Malcolm X that says, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." So how are we best preparing our kids for tomorrow?
Okay, so let's start preparing by having more of a common language, right? A few more definitions. We mentioned, institutional and systemic bias and racism. We're going to talk about implicit bias, which is that individual level, and how it fits into the bigger picture and why it's important. But let's start with our individual selves, right? Our implicit bias. Implicit bias is just the tendency in this context to favor, right, or disfavor an individual or group based on their identity, okay? And it can be harmful because, one, we all have implicit biases. No one is immune from them. But also, if we're not aware of them, then we will unintentionally harm others and have negative impacts on others. So that awareness is critical. It operates in the unconscious part of our brain. The implicit bias is in the back deepest recesses of our minds, right? It's in that part of our mind that's always on autopilot, going rapid fire, right? The unconscious part of our mind dictates 99.9% of the decisions that we make. And so it's very influential in everything that we do. And it's important for us to understand, again, this is not about intention, but this is about outcomes. We are not going to intend for our implicit biases to harm others or other groups or other individuals, but it will happen without us realizing it if we're not aware. So this conversation about implicit bias is about awareness, right? Because we don't want to continue to do harm to others, especially our students. So where do our biases come from? There are many biases and a lot of ways that we get our biases. We get our biases from the world around us, right? From the time we're born, we start learning and experiencing, hearing and seeing things that are feeding our young minds, that are feeding the unconscious part of our minds. And a lot of them are true and some of them are not true and they're not factual, right? Those stereotypes that we learn, those are creating our implicit biases. And then throughout our lives, those same things continue to perpetuate and support our biases. From the time we're young, the movies that we watch, the cartoons that we watch, the books that were read as children, right? They all show certain identities in certain manners and ways. Those are creating our implicit biases. Children as young as 3 have been studied to show that at that young of an age, they already have implicit biases, right? They're shown the doll experiment, a black doll and a white doll, and asked questions. Which one's pretty? Which one's smart? Which one's bad? Which one's good? And as young as 3, they've already made those distinguishing ideas in their mind from the things that they've learned up into that very short period of time in their lives. Okay. We get our biases, our assumptions and our implicit biases from our families, our peer groups, our communities, our churches, our spiritual entities, our education system, okay? Media, the news, entertainment, you name it. So there's no way to get around it. And so that's why we have to understand we all have them. How do we become aware of them to change how we impact others? So we're just going to give you two examples. Confirmation bias is one example, right? That very basic desire to seek out or hone in on information that confirms our belief system, right? That supports what we already believe to be true. There may be a lot of evidence to the contrary, but we are trying instinctively to feed what we know to be true, okay? And with that, let's say I'm a teacher in a classroom and I have a student whose previous teacher shares information with me. Maybe it's not the best information. Maybe it's some challenges the student has had, some behavioral issues the student has had. And they share them with me because they're trying to prepare me to take this student forward in the coming year. I can't unknow that, right? So my instinct is going to be to confirm what I now know to believe, what I now know to be true, that there are some challenges with the student. And then my mind is going to instinctively go towards finding those things in that student's behavior and performance that support that, rather than supporting something else or being objective. I'm not doing it intentionally. I'm not trying to harm the student. It is happening if I'm not conscious about this potential impact of my confirmation bias. Okay? Affinity bias. We all have connections with people. We all have certain good feelings about someone that we've just met for a multitude of reasons, right? We went to the same college, we grew up in the same town, our kids go to the same daycare, we shop at the same grocery store, whatever it is. But if we are not aware that we have these potential affinity biases, we again could have negative impacts on people that we don't have that same affinity with, okay? Having the affinity bias is not bad, but not being aware of the negative impacts on those we don't have that bias for could be a problem, especially again, if we're in a position of power or influence. And most of the adults in the education system are all in some position of power or influence over students in some way or another. So let's talk about a study that was done in 2016 when it showed that there was increased severity of suggestions for discipline when the race of the teacher was not the same as the race of the student. Okay, so when I don't have an affinity towards a particular student, they don't identify like me, I'm not going to give them the same benefit of the doubt as I'm going to give those students that I identify with. Not intentionally again, but it's going to happen if I am not aware. And we also know that the majority of teachers in our systems are white. So what does that mean for our students of color? Now let's expand that. Let's talk a little bit about the institutional and systemic racism, right? And we start with the implicit bias because yes, it's that individual piece, but it's important for all of us to understand our role in the bigger picture, right? Fixing the institutional and systemic issues is incumbent on all of us stepping in and doing our own work. Right? And so we have to understand our individual role in the bigger picture. But the institutions and the systems are also biased. We have institutional and systemic racism. They exist just based on the way that the institutions and systems were created and who created them. So it's our role to figure out how to change them. Let's talk about policies, practices, procedures, programs. Okay? We have to look at all of those things, even policies that are facially neutral, right? We're not living in the 1800s where we put the word race in the document, right? We're living in a time where we don't have the racial terms in our documents, yet we still have inequitable outcomes for people of color. That is because even when those documents don't say the race on the document, they still in implementation have the same impacts based on race. And that's because of the way they were created and the way our implicit biases come in and the status quo that has been around for a very long time that we have not changed yet. Let's talk about how some of these institutional and systemic biases and racism impact our students, right? Suspensions, expulsions, discipline, when SROs are brought into the picture, graduation rates, who's called on more in class by a teacher, right? Who is considered hyperactive versus disruptive? Right? Who is given the benefit of the doubt? Who is assumed to be the troublemaker? Who is more likely to be in special education? Who's more likely to be in advanced placement classes? Who's more likely to be in gifted and talented? Right? We focus on institutional and systemic change because they are the areas where the most harm is done. And because of that, they are the areas where the most positive change can occur. But we have to know how we fit individually into those systems. Doesn't matter how large the system is. That's irrelevant. As long as we all share a common language, common values, shared goals, as long as we're all working towards the same strategic, intentional, and thoughtful desired outcomes, the size of the organization is irrelevant. Okay. And we have to be mindful, right? As we all know, we didn't get here overnight. It took us over 400 years to get to where we are today. We're not going to change it overnight. We have to have patience. We have to have grace with one another. We have to be in it for the long game. Right? If we want this change to be sustainable, we have to understand it's not going to change overnight. But we have to start now, because now is absolutely the time. One more quote, Socrates. The secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And this is why we talk about equity and implicit bias, because it's so important in making those institutional and systemic changes, right? Our implicit biases, the long game, the rebuilding, right? Not just adding some, nice fluffy words to our strategic plan, but to really delving in to the work that we do and how we do it, right? To really change the dynamics, to really question our assumptions. That's what this work is about.
And this system, these systems and institutions were built, the bias within them was built brick by brick, law by law, policy by policy, legislation by legislation, program by program. And if we're going to undo it, we have to undo it in that same strategic, thoughtful, focused way, or else we just play hopscotch with one piece at a time, which doesn't really change anything overall. So hopefully you're getting a sense of the shotgun approach to this conversation this morning. There's a lot coming at you in a much bigger picture. But what are some of examples of how it plays out, this institutional and systemic bias plays out inside your schools, in your institutions? So I just have some questions for you. Did Columbus really discover America? Can you discover something that already has people living in it? How do you discover something like that? Are we really a melting pot? How come we're not a salad or a stew that doesn't assume everyone melts together and assimilates into the one system, as opposed to the stew that's got the carrots and the potatoes and the meat and the corn, right? That don't become anything else, but they add to the value of that stew. Does African-American history only start with slavery and end with civil rights movement and maybe Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech? Do students even know that Colorado is a Spanish word and where it came from? What's the definition of the classics in literature or in music? And how are you rolling those out? Can a student comfortably tell a story about their two dads or their two moms? Who defines what a nuclear family is? Are the lessons and learnings about women, Latinos, Black folks, Native Americans, LGBTQ, folks with a disability infused into the curriculum on a regular basis outside of the month, the week, or the day that we are given to celebrate? Well, we don't have any Black folks, so we don't really have to celebrate Black History Month. Makes no sense whatsoever. Was manifest destiny really a great way to conquer the West, or was it genocide? Are we ever going to talk about President Andrew Jackson as a genocidal maniac or not? What is the context within which we provide the facts to our students? Do students feel like they belong because they're part of the everyday curriculum and the educational environment? Do students feel like they belong because the perspectives that represent them are part of the curriculum and the everyday educational environment? You know, I could go on with lots more questions, but if you've never thought about these types of questions, what does that say about how we're ensuring that all children really feel like they belong?
And it's important to remember too, when we say difference, right? Diversity or difference, this is not deficit, right? Diversity and difference does not equal deficit, does not equal negative attribute. We have to shift the way we think about difference to understand that that difference is a value add. It's a strength, right? And only then will that feeling of belongingness for others really begin to happen. Only then will that feeling of belonging of families and parents in the community really begin to happen, right? Because this isn't just about how you engage with your students. This is how do you engage with the parents? Sometimes the parents can be some of the biggest challenges, right? How do you bring them into this work the same way that you're trying to bring your students into this work? How are students and families' experiences, lived experiences, and identities seen in the curriculum? How are they seen in the everyday classroom environment, right? It's important to that inclusion, that sense of belonging and reaching those equitable outcomes. All those little things matter.
There was a study done of all of the books, children's books published in 2018. And there was an evaluation of who was shown in those books. As I recall now, Native Americans were shown in 1% of all the books published. Latinos were shown in 7% of all the books published.
Animals were depicted more than people of color in children's books in 2018. Okay. So we're not just afraid to talk about race, we're afraid to write about race or read about race. And let's remember in all of this work, how critical intersectionality is. None of us walks through the world with one identity. And if we carry more than one marginalized identity, that just increases the potential for harm and increases the chances for detrimental or inequitable outcomes, right? I could be a brown female with a disability who identifies as an LGBTQ member, right? That's 4 layers of marginalized identities and 4 layers of the potential harms that I will face as I walk through this world.
And so for us, our desire is to help you create that sense of cultural humility, create that sense of cultural curiosity, the continuing sense of the desire for more learning to improve your teaching, what it looks like in the classroom, and improving the outcomes for all of your students. And so we referenced how each individual can impact the institution positively or maintain the status quo. So some examples of what you can do inside your classroom, right? Just some examples. One, learn the students' names as they're actually pronounced.
We've heard so many stories of adults who are still traumatized by having their names botched as children, or having been renamed by the educator, or having been given a nickname, right, that's easier for the adult to pronounce, or having been given a white sounding name because it's easier for them to remember. And this has long-lasting traumatizing effects on people. Our names are important to us. They're part of who we are. We're proud of our names. And if others can't even take the time to get our names right and pronounce them how we pronounce them, that's significant. That's huge.
There's nothing that sounds sweeter than the sound of your name, right? Question your assumptions. Question the assumptions of what you've learned and how you've continued to do what you do. Why do you think this is the best way to do it? Based on what? Just question the assumptions. Your assumptions may be absolutely accurate, but if you never begin to ask about them, nothing can change and you don't know how well you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Bring in speakers of different identities. No better way to shatter in unfactual stereotypes that we've learned over the years than to see people who aren't like us in great positions, doing great things in the world, right? Bring them into the classroom. Show students, even if you have an all-white student classroom, show them, here's what exists out in the world besides your own small environment. Give them the opportunity to experience those things that can change their implicit biases.
Empower your students to share their thoughts. Sometimes it's better to facilitate than just teach. How do you have and create the dialogue and discussion in class around your subject matter that might be able to, you might be able to bring in current events to talk about math, current events to talk about your English class, how do you facilitate that conversation that makes it much more relevant sometimes to your students?
How do you bring in those other races and ethnicities into the examples that you use, right? Even the smallest examples, how do you bring them into that? And how do you have these conversations, right? These difficult conversations, because like we said earlier, race is the hardest thing to talk about in an organization, in a school, in any environment, at your dinner table during Thanksgiving. That is one of the hardest conversations to have. So how do you have them, right? How do we help empower you and give you the tools to be able to have them and have them comfortably? Because the worst thing to do is to have the conversation come up by a student or a family member and to shut it down, right? Better for you to step into it and make a mistake than to avoid the conversation. Because when you avoid or shut down the conversation, you're then avoiding and shutting down that person's identity. Okay? You're devaluing that identity that could have been part of that conversation. And that quote, I don't know who it was, but mistakes prove that we are trying. So make the mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. We are all going to make mistakes. We will all continue to make mistakes. None of us are experts in this, right? But a child will love you for trying. I promise you. So let's talk a little bit now about something else that plays into not feeling like you belong, right? That not inclusive environment, right? And we're talking about microaggressions, okay? Because they happen all the time. They happen between students and students. They happen between students and adults. They happen between adults, right? And microaggressions are nothing more than those verbal and nonverbal engagements that are insults or they're offensive, right? They don't mean to be harmful, but they are harmful, right? They're targeted towards individuals with marginalized identities, right? Microaggressions are founded in race, right? Because they started when people were studying the way white people were treating Black people on Harvard's campus, right? But it has since grown and expanded. It covers all marginalized identities. And not a day goes by when somebody with a marginalized identity doesn't have the potential to be the recipient of a microaggression. Okay. And like equity, it's not about intentions. It's about impacts, right? It's about harm. You will have the best intentions in the world, but you could still harm somebody. I could be trying to build a relationship and get to know you and learn about you and commit a microaggression, right? My wonderful intentions aren't going to change the harm that I am inflicted on somebody else, right? And it's a pretty big topic, but we just wanted to touch on it because we know you all are experiencing it. There are a ton of examples in a school that happen, right? We hear white students using the N-word in slang, right? And not understanding the impacts. Black students having their hair touched, right? Saying you can't understand somebody with an accent when really you're just not trying to understand because they're speaking very well, right? Expecting the Black students to be athletic, expecting Asian students to be the best at math and science, right? Saying somebody speaks good English because you assume English is not their first language, okay? These are all things that are done and said, not out of ill intent, but will still be harmful in their impacts. And it's important for us to understand that and learn more about that and do our own work around this. because we all have committed microaggressions. But learn what they look like, learn where they come from, right? Create that second thought within your mind to try and stop yourself from committing future microaggressions. And if you make the mistake of committing a microaggression, own it and just apologize and learn from it, okay?
Because we're all gonna do them. We're all gonna make them. Just own it. Appreciate when somebody tells you the impact of what you just said, and own it.
And please don't say, I'm sorry, but leave the but out, right? Don't try and explain it. Don't try and justify it. Don't try and share your intentions, because then you just minimize the experience of the person who was harmed by the microaggression. Just apologize, learn from it, and don't make the same mistake twice. That's the best you can do. Macro microaggressions are just as harmful, right? We're not conducting them on an individual level, but they're all around us in the world we live and walk in, right? In your schools, what's hanging on the walls? What's depicted in your education environments? If I walk in as an immigrant from a country, English is not my first language, maybe I'm brown, whatever the case is, do I feel like this is a place that I'm welcomed, that people understand and understand me and have learned about me? Am I walking in feeling like I am a part of this environment? Or am I feeling again like that other, right?
We always talk about the demographics are changing. No, they're not. They've changed. We just haven't caught up to the change yet.
What's the name of our schools? The biggest one in education, what are the names of our mascots, right? Those are all macro, microaggressions, and they're just as harmful, and I would say even so more harmful than the individual microaggressions, because we can move away from an individual who is microaggressing on us, but we can't move away from our environment. It is in our face all the time. So how do we as institutions become aware of those macro microaggressions that we are allowing to continue in our environment? And how do we change those? Right? Because it all comes back to, how do we continue to ensure we're making everyone feel like they belong? Maya Angelou quote, Maya Angelou, okay? People will forget what you did. People will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And there's the essence of why it's important to understand microaggressions and macro microaggressions.
And specifically, the impressionableness of young kids. You are their world for the majority of their day. How are you making them feel? How are you making them feel heard? How are you making them feel they belong?
And, you know, if you don't remember anything else from this, remember that whether we're talking about how to make people feel like they belong, how to create an inclusive environment, what equity is, right? How not to do microaggressions. The most important pieces to those are, again, remembering these aren't about intentions. We're not saying any of you have bad intentions. We're not asking you to tap into your inner racist, right? We are saying we all have implicit biases. We all commit microaggressions. We all are a part of a larger institution that has macro microaggressions. So what do we do, right? How do we ensure that we're not upholding the dominant culture status quo that has harmed so many people outside that dominant culture? How do we shift that, right? How do we get to those equitable outcomes? How do we step away from our own intentions and realize this is much bigger than any one of us individually? All the things that we do, big and little, matter, right? To ensure that our students and our families feel like they belong and have equitable outcomes in the end, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve outcomes. All of these things matter when we desire to have an environment where every student, every family member, every staff member can be present as their authentic selves and will be seen, heard, and valued for it.
So lots of questions going through chat. So we're gonna just finish with a quote, which is, every student is one caring adult away from success. However, caring is not necessarily enough. Are you learning to care better? So we wish you much success on behalf of all of our students. And this afternoon, if you want to learn a little bit more and have an opportunity for more discussion, we'll see you this afternoon. So we truly thank you so much for your time in engaging in this conversation, and welcome the questions that you put together.
Thank you.
So Dante and Christina, I see one big thing is how do we balance really addressing the needs of every student and their belonging in our schools with confronting some of the hostile or uninterested or disagreement out there from either community or possibly families, etc.
That's a great question, and we hear that so much. And one of the most important things when any individual or institution is stepping into this work is to remember that you have to step into it with the full commitment. Like any change, there are going to be dissenters. There are going to be people who are afraid of it. There are going to be people who challenge it. You have to be committed to the reason you stepped into this work so that you can manage those challenges when they happen, because they will happen. But if you let those challenges or those dissenters steer you away or push you back or stop you from doing this, don't even start it in the first place, because it will happen.
And to be able to stand on the fact that now this is a value of the district where you work, right? The school board passed a resolution about equity not that long ago, thanks to folks on this Zoom call. It's a value. And so we are responsive to the value of the organization where we work and the expectation that this is how we will inform and educate our children. So you might have a different thinking process, but this is how the school district where your children attend educate your children. This is the value that's important.
Thank you. So I hear, what is your why and how do we foster that sense of belonging and understanding our purpose? So thank you. I appreciate that. And feel free, any of our panelists, to jump in too. I started collecting themes and I'm sure you did as well. We had another one. How do we really address that continuum of readiness when some people are more ready than others to really jump in to our equity work? And like you said, the equity policy that was passed and that resolution to commitment to equity. How do we address readiness and where do we go from here?
How do we address what?
Readiness. So
Readiness. Yep, sorry.
this is a way, right? This is building the organizational capacity to be more ready. And so how do we continue these conversations? How do we continue to provide this professional development so that you as individual teachers have a comfort level of stepping into this work? Because more often than not, it's, I don't know how to do this, so I'll just not, versus how do I learn to do this better? So this type of professional development, we would certainly suggest, is how you improve the comfort level of folks to step into this work.
Absolutely. Continue to develop the common language, continue to develop the shared understanding and the values, and educating yourselves and one another. Because what we found is that one of the biggest reasons people fail to step into this work is out of the fear of the unknown, right? They don't know. They don't know what they don't know. They don't know how to fix it. And so they're afraid of making mistakes. And so they choose not to step into it. So the more tools and education you can give people around this, the more likely they will be to step into it and engage.
And it becomes a normal part of the conversation and expectation. So all the directors of departments on the call, this should be a part of your staff meetings. This is not just some one-off. This should be a part of your staff meetings to ensure asking the questions about how are we doing with folks with a disability, with folks who are of color, with girl students, with boy students. Asking the questions, it isn't an accusation of anything, but you have to ask the question even to determine what our baseline is, to know that the expectation is we will be checking to see how well we're doing, because this is important.
Thank you. And with our last couple of minutes here, we had a question or a number of questions around what are some strategies and very specific steps for Douglas County School District? I know you mentioned a number just recently with questioning our assumptions, having speakers of different identities, empowering students to share, and opening the conversation, being open to accepting our microaggressions when they do happen. What are some additional strategies or next steps that you would think are very important for our district to take?
Well, great question. I would suggest one of the things that the district is working on, the equity cohort is working on, is a racial equity plan, or just an equity plan. Because hope is not a plan. And if you're just trying to address one thing at a time, you're just playing hopscotch, and there's no strategic approach to doing this and ensuring it's getting done. So you can have a district plan. You could also have an individual internal school plan. How is your school looking at its outcomes specifically? Put something together so that you can then evaluate how well you're doing based on the plan that you put together.
Mm-hmm. And these plans are so important because, like we talked about, each individual having a role in the larger change, individuals need to know what their role looks like, right? And how they engage in the larger change. And those plans can be just that. And then we'll be talking more about strategies and suggestions this afternoon as well. If anyone wants to join, we'll have more time to kind of delve into some of those strategies.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And I'm going to open it up to our other panelists. Those are the main themes that I've found. Any last question before it's 9 o'clock?
I don't have a question, but I do want to make sure that we emphasize, realize this is just a starting point, right? Just a conversation starter. And I know that there are some people who are maybe even feeling uncomfortable. And I appreciate those of you who've reached out and said things like, well, I don't believe I'm prejudiced and things like that. And remember that the focus of this conversation isn't to say you're bad, you're prejudiced, you're doing wrong things. It's to be reflective as educators, right? To give ourselves a chance to think about some of the comments and the conversation that's going on. One of the best things we do as educators is we reflect on what our work is. So that way we can always do better. And if it gives you an opportunity to reflect on maybe some of the points that have been brought up, and that you can provide even more for your students and for our parents on the call, the same thing. If it allows you to reflect as a parent on maybe some of those conversations that you have, that's the benefit of it, right? That's the power of it. And that's what you want to do. We want to be reflective because that's the only way we can actually make positive change and move forward effectively.
And if I can, I saw a question go by about how do you deal with white folks who feel that they're losing power in this conversation. And I would suggest that it's not about losing power, it's about empowering others. Isn't taking anything away from white parents or white children. It's how do we now recognize the other folks who maybe have not been recognized the same way in the past. So it's not a zero-sum game. It's not pie. It's how do we ensure that we're recognizing everybody in a positive way to ensure that the outcomes can be better served for everyone, not losing anything because I'm white.
Saw a number of you also ask when Dante and Christina are going to be back this afternoon, and Remy put that in the chat. It's from 4 to 6:15 this afternoon, so it's a much longer session where you can really dig in with them. And it's called Your Child in Equity, What You Need to Know. So look in your sched, 4 o'clock to 6:15. I just want to say thank you. Go ahead, Jack. Go ahead.
Just in watching reading the chats, it's really interesting that many of the questions that are being asked and many of the comments that are being made, these are questions and comments that were made 20 years ago. Some things have not changed. And so, you know, many of the teachers are wanting to have change come to place, but they don't necessarily know how. Many teachers have concerns about how to address the community who may not agree with them or agree with the direction that maybe the district is headed. And so these are the same kinds of questions and concerns that have been around forever. And we as a school district need to make sure that teachers have the tools to be able to address their concerns.
All right, well, we're nearing the end of our session, and it was wonderful, and I wish we could keep going for hours. And the Gemini Group will be back. There'll be more communication around that. I'm sure we'll have a long-lasting relationship with them and use them in further Making Connection workshop, hopefully. It is 9 o'clock, and just to remember to everybody that all these sessions in the workshop will be recorded. And if you registered for the event, then we're going to be sending out a document with everything in there, all the recordings, so you can go back and watch this one and access other ones that you weren't able to take. The next one is at 9:15 to 10:15. That'll be our next session group. So I hope you join us there. Dante and Christina, thank you so much for your wisdom and just your commitment to this work and being here with us. You can tell by our chat that people are very appreciative, and it's a beautiful thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been our pleasure, and we look forward to more conversations with you all. I appreciate you stepping into this work. So thank you.